Thank you, George. As Dr. Waring mentioned, we're going to be talking about looking at the patient's own optics as opposed to implanting some, and finding the genetic connection between their cornea's health and disease and what we can do in the refractive space and for general health of these patients. So for those who don't know Avellino, I'd like to give you just a brief introduction. Back in 2008, we started with the first PCR-based genetic test for corneal dystrophies, for Avellino dystrophy as it was, or GCD2 as it's more commonly called now. And for the work that we did over the next 7 years, we received an award from the World Economic Forum as a new technology pioneer. Shortly after that, in 2016, we began our genetic therapy program with the Ulster University, Tara Moore leading that. And then 2019, which brings us to today, where we're very proud to be able to launch the Avogen NGS test for keratoconus risk factors and TGF-beta-I corneal dystrophies. We'll be launching this test this month. To give you an idea, though, about the company, while we are not an ophthalmic company, we have a very large investment in ophthalmology, but we really operate on 3 pillars. The first being genetic diagnostics, which feeds our genetic database, which then leads to future diagnostics and gene therapies. Each one of these improves and informs the other pillars and continues this cycle for us as a company. Now, even though we're not an ophthalmic company, as you can see, we're very heavily invested in ophthalmology, both in the scientists we work with as well as the clinical advisors that have joined us to make sure that we bring this new type of testing to the market in a way that's both responsible and data-driven. So after 10 years of development, we're introducing this test this month. We're very proud to say that we've recently received our CLIA certification and will be able to operate in the United States in all states except for New York. They have a slightly different requirement, so we're currently putting our paperwork and going through the process there in New York, and that will be available early 2020. But this was a development that took time because we had to reach the extent of technology as it existed. So once we were able to reach the extent of PCR testing after finding 11 different mutations for the TGF-beta-I corneal dystrophies, we then moved to NGS testing. And by using next-gen sequencing, we could then take on much more complicated diseases such as keratoconus. So this test now looks at over 1,000 SNPs or SNPs across 75 genes that are associated with keratoconus. If you talk to most corneal surgeons, they're going to tell you keratoconus is not a single disease. There's not one gene, there's not one factor, and we completely agree. And as you see by the number of SNPs we're looking at, we have done the homework and the clinical tests to prove it. There's a lot of data we'd like to share with you, particularly case studies of where the genetics of a family and of an individual contribute to the progression of the disease, but we have 7 minutes here today. So we'll invite you Sunday evening to join us, 5:30 to 7:30 at the YBCA across the street, and we'll be showing more case studies there. So why the genetic test for keratoconus? Common sense today and most understanding within the corneal specialist community is that this is a disease of either eye rubbing or environment. If you live in a high UV, hot, dusty area, very likely to progress. If you rub your eye, you're very likely to progress. But no matter what a physician's standpoint on the progression of keratoconus, they all have the small caveat of, oh, yeah, and family history, that counts too. Well, the problem with family history is it's notoriously unreliable. You're asking a patient to actually have an understanding of both genetics and cornea disease in order to properly communicate the history of that disease to the physician. We know that that is not happening very regularly. The other issue that when we look at family histories is how well can it be reported based on technology. The 2 items on the left are easily observable or scannable by a physician in his office. A family history up until now has not been able to be done objectively. You've had to ask the patient and rely on that information. Genetic testing makes the difference. A recent study published by Healthegy in Ophthalmology this year gave even more credence to that. If you look at the top 3 contributing factors to over 11,000 patients, the first one that he noted was genealogical history. Where were they from? What was their family history? What was their genetics? Then there's the age of the patient when they first presented, and then finally, how great was their K or corneal curvature at baseline? Again, something that reinforces the individuality of this disease, but previously you could not find it because genetic testing was not available. Now we know too that the prevalence of keratoconus is far higher, 5 to 10 times higher than most people believe. With each study that comes out since the original understanding 20 years ago of 1 in 2,000, we hear 1 in 350, 1 in 25 even in some populations. And when you look at just corneal curvature alone, there's over 300 million patients in the world that could be at risk for developing keratoconus. Now, if there's 300 million patients and only 4,000 corneal specialists, we have to find a better way to define these patients early, get them into monitoring programs or early treatment. Because this meeting's in the US, we're going to look just at the North America figures here. There are 11 million people, just based on corneal curvature indicators alone, that could be at risk for keratoconus. However, there's only less than 500,000 that are under treatment or being observed and watched regularly for this disease. So we know there's a massive area for improvement in potential and care, especially early detection. But it's not just corneal curvature. That's a vast group of the population. But what about contact lens candidates? Anyone that's rubbing the eye or depriving the eye of oxygen, regardless of what environment or where they live in the world. We know with the rise of myopia, orthokeratology is getting more and more play as the best way to help young people stall that myopia advancement. The problem is if you have a patient who's predisposed to keratoconus and you put that patient in a hard, rigid lens that deprives the cornea of oxygen and then rub that cornea for 8 to 10 hours every day for several months, you are very likely to exacerbate that predisposition. It's well documented that refractive surgery candidates and those with family history are also those that should be watched or followed for potential keratoconus or ectasia. So how do we do it then? How does genetic testing operate to find these patients or find risk factors in these patients? Well, the Avellino product is a sampling kit that we'll be able to provide to the physician's office, and with a simple buccal swab in the clinic, they will send that to us. We will extract the patient's DNA from the swab, sequence it, reference it, and look at variant risk scores compared to our populations that we studied, and then provide a patient report. Now, this report will be given in a portal both to the physician and the patient. We want to make this as easy as possible for both the physician and the patient, remove paper, remove a lot of the communication issues and logistical issues that in-office testing and submitted testing has today in ophthalmology. We want to make this as easy as possible for the physician to administer and the patient to receive. So what does a result look like? Here are the typical results. You'll notice red, yellow, green. Not just corneal specialists, but physicians that do any diagnostics like to have a bit of a grid. They like to know where the patient lands on that color bar. So we've provided that in accordance with our ranking of relative risk of these particular variants from high risk to low. However, it should be noted that even at low risk, it's still a risk. These particular variants show up in the positively diagnosed keratoconus cohorts. So if it's on the report, it is a risk. What is the accuracy? Well, we're very proud to say during our CLIA certification, we were able to identify these variants with 98% accuracy. That's even high, even in the CLIA community. For the corneal dystrophies, it's well documented that any patient that has one of these variants for corneal dystrophies will likely develop them over the course of their life, so we don't provide a risk score there. Just having that particular dystrophy named on the report is usually enough. But the future is where we want to get to. Even greater.
Eric, I'm going to have you wrap up.
Yep. And this will be the last one. Being able to map these genes is going to be more important as we go into the future, and then moving into other diseases from the front to the back of the eye. So early detection, education on the disease, and empowering physicians and patients to make better choices is what we're delivering.
Perfect. Very, very exciting. And thank you so much.